Hello, Danielle. Hello, everybody. My name is Małgorzata Bakalarz-Diverge, and I'm Director of Academic Programs at the Center for Jewish History. I'm happy to welcome you today to our virtual space. Center for Jewish History is a home for archival collections of 5 partner institutions: YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, Leo Baeck Institute, American Jewish Historical Society, Yeshiva University Museum, and American Sephardi Federation. Together, these collections create the second largest archive of the Jewish experience in the world. The center aspires to be an intellectual home for exchanges of ideas, scholarship, creative practice, and groundbreaking encounters that are inspired by and informed by these archival collections. Tonight, we will have an opportunity to learn from an Association for Jewish Studies Dissertation Fellow, Danielle Willard-Kyle. Her research project, called Living in Liminal Spaces, Refugees in Italian Displaced Person Camps, 1945-1951, recovers the stories of long-silenced European and North African Jewish displaced persons after World War II. Let me briefly introduce our speaker. Danielle Willard-Kyle is currently a Ph.D. candidate in history at Rutgers University. She received her master's degrees in Jewish Studies from the University of Oxford and in History and Jewish Studies from the University of Toronto. She has given presentations on her research at multiple national and international academic conferences and has received numerous grants and fellowships, including the Association for Jewish Studies Dissertation Fellowship, the Steven Spielberg Endowment for Jewish Studies, and the Memory of the Shoah Special Doctoral Fellowship, that's a long one, the Shoah Foundation Center for Genocide Research Fellowship, and the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies Fellowship. Before I leave the stage to our speaker, I would like to remind 3 housekeeping things. First of all, you are welcome to write down your questions for the Q&A portion of our talk. Please only use the Q&A function to do so. On the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a little button called Q&A. Type your questions over there, and I will be reading them to our speaker. Secondly, the chat functionality does not work among participants. In other words, I will be the only person who will be able to read what you post if you post something in chat, not anyone else. I know that some people get confused about that and frustrated, so I want to clarify it at the very beginning. And finally, our program is recorded and will be available within a week or so. And now, without further ado, Danielle, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Mago. Let me get this up and running. Before I begin, I'd like to say a few thank yous. So thank you to the Center for Jewish History for virtually hosting this online event, and to Malgo in particular for all your help getting this all set up. I'd also like to thank the Association for Jewish Studies for both co-sponsoring this event and for supporting my dissertation fellowship and research. Living in Liminal Spaces, Refugees in Italian Displaced Persons Camps, 1945 to 1951. 59 and balding, the short, bespectacled psychologist adjusted his suit and tie before exiting the car at the Teatro just outside Milan on August 31st, 1946. Heading into the camp, he dragged behind him 60 pounds of equipment, including a Model 50 wire recorder, 200 spools of wire, and an assortment of converters and transformers, which he immediately set up in a central room. Intrigued, some of the residents, refugees who had survived the Holocaust and fled war-torn regions of Eastern and Central Europe, wandered over to inspect the polished professor with his Russian accent and his strange contraption. Despite having been on the road, making interviews for over a month, Dr. David Boder was eager to begin, aware he had had a very limited window of time to spend in Europe. After joining the residents for a meal, Boder requested that they sing into his wire recorder, and when they finished, he played it back for them. The wonder of hearing their own voices recorded was boundless, Boder later recalled, as many had never seen a recording device before. He then asked for a few volunteers who would be willing to be interviewed and recorded for preservation and later psychological study. This lecture looks at the path toward rehabilitation that many refugees Jewish refugees in Italian Displaced Persons camp took. It argues that the end goal for the vast majority of Jewish refugees was to leave Europe. Their primary goal was to resettle, rehabilitate, and indeed restart life in a completely new place. The first portion of the lecture demonstrates that refugees primarily went to Italy with the express intention of leaving. Here, it'll explore the idea of Italy as the Porta di Zion, or the door to Zion, that is Palestine or Israel. Through its examination of the paths open to refugees, it ultimately shows that the immigration from Italy was neither the easy nor the fast process many had believed it would be. The second portion of the talk will focus on the liminal period of waiting, when the DPs realized they would need to begin their own rehabilitation process there in Italy. It argues that this rehabilitation began with the return of cultural activities to the lives of those in the camps. But this renewal was neither accepted by nor extended to all the Jewish refugees. The final section shows that it was in fact limited to the European DPs, and North African refugees in DP camps struggled to receive basic status and physical rehabilitation. It was in a refugee camp that David Boder, that psychology professor from Chicago, would learn that for most Jewish refugees, Italy was viewed simply as a way station to Palestine. In 1946, David Boder traveled across the ocean to these DP or displaced persons and refugee centers in France, Italy, Switzerland, and Germany in order to talk to survivors of the Holocaust. In total, Boder interviewed 130 refugees in 9 languages on a wire recorder, producing the first repository of oral testimony from the Holocaust. "Why did you come to Italy?" Boder asked his interviewees. Quote, "Because from Italy, we knew the way goes to Palestine," replied George Kay, a survivor of Birkenau and Auschwitz. Nechama E., a newly married survivor, also described the singular focus of her travel. "From Poland, I departed for Czechoslovakia. From Czechoslovakia, I went to Germany. From Germany, I came to Italy, and now I find myself here. And I say again, my struggle is for one thing only, and this one thing has remained for me: to come together with my husband to Eretz Israel, and to build a Jewish home together with all my brothers and sisters." Both of these refugees make it clear that the received wisdom at the time was that going through Italy was the best way to make Aliyah, that is, the ascent or the move to Israel. A questionnaire designed by the Organization of Jewish Refugees in Italy in 1945 also confirmed that this was the case. Of the 91,000 responses they received, 98% wanted to emigrate to Palestine. As relatively recent arrivals to the camps, however, they could not know that many would be stuck in Italy until at least 1948. At the end of the Second World War, the makeup of the Jewish population in Italy changed dramatically. Over the course of the 1945 summer alone, between 13 and 15,000 non-Italian Jewish displaced persons entered the country. The majority of these foreign Jews came primarily from Eastern and Central Europe, fleeing the continued anti-Semitism of their home countries and the dismal conditions of the DP camps in Austria and Germany. Most received help from the Zionist organization Bricha, or Flight, which was created as a network to connect illegal and legal organized movement of Jews from Eastern Europe to Palestine. And Italy was a desired transit point, not only for European Jewish refugees, but also for refugees coming from North Africa, especially those coming from the former colony of Libya. Between 1948 and 1951, a small minority of Jewish refugees, estimated at between 3,000 and 5,000 individuals, also traveled to Italy from Libya, largely through the destination you can see on the map, seeking asylum and passage to Palestine. They were fleeing persecution in their homeland, particularly after the pogroms of 1945 and 1948. Unable to travel directly to Israel because the British would not grant exit permits, Libyan Jews made the difficult passage across the Mediterranean to Italy, often smuggled in fishing boats, because although it took them in the wrong direction geographically, this was still easier than traveling directly from Libya to Israel. So in total, nearly 50,000 Jewish refugees entered Italy between 1945 and 1951. The majority wanted to immigrate to Israel. By the end of 1949, nearly all Jewish DPs had left Italy, and the final refugee camp closed in 1951. However, for those intervening years, tens of thousands remained in Italy unsure of their futures. Once in the country, refugees could enter transit camps that were grouped largely in two categories: displaced persons camps, or DP camps, and Haksharot, which were agricultural training centers. So in total, there were at least 35 displaced persons camps and 97 Haksharot in Italy between 1945 and 1951, although not all were active the whole time, and their sizes varied really quite a bit. The DP camps were created by the Allied forces in Germany, Austria, and Italy. And these temporary accommodations were often former concentration camps and internment camps, as well as larger buildings such as army barracks, schools, houses, and even a film studio that was requisitioned by the Allies. The Haksharot, on the other hand, were started primarily by the Jewish Agency through members of the Jewish Brigade for Palestine. These were Zionist training centers where Jews would learn the skills deemed necessary to live in Palestine, most notably farming and Hebrew language. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, and its successor, the International Refugee Organization, or IRO, were primarily tasked with registering, providing care and maintenance, including food, clothing, shelter, and financial resources, and repatriating and later resettling these DPs. They were aided in their work by a host of voluntary agencies, including the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the JDC, who funded many of the operations in and out of the camps, and the Organization for Rehabilitation Through Training, or ORT, who set up various certificate programs such as carpentry or electrical work in the camp. Zvi Miller wanted to make Aliyah more than anything, but was forced because of a British blockade and quota to remain for longer than he expected in Europe. The British had closed off nearly all immigration to Palestine following the White Paper of 1939. While living in the Santa Maria di Bagni DP camp in southern Italy, Miller, a young refugee from Romania, spent a large portion of his time painting. The product of this painting was the 3 large murals that covered the walls of a small house several meters from the sea, and these murals are depicted here on the screen. The first mural depicts a young woman with 2 children attempting to enter Palestine, but being blocked by a British soldier. The second mural shows a map of Italy and Palestine. There's barbed wire all along the edge of Italy, and thus a symbol for the rest of Europe, and an arrow pointing to southern Italy, from where a bridge is drawn across to the promised land of Palestine. The final mural illustrates 2 Palestinian Jewish soldiers standing guard to the menorah inside the Star of David. The moral of the story is clear here. The British soldiers may have command now, but eventually Jewish refugees will prevail. It is worth noting that the villain in this story is the British, not the Italian soldier nor the former German enemy. It was, at least in part, specifically because of Italy's complicated history of anti-Semitism before the advent of fascism, its nebulous wartime experience and uneven treatment of Jews prior to 1943, and its post-war connection to Britain, that many Jews felt it was the country to travel to get to Palestine. Racial laws and internment camps were instituted in Italy in 1938, but deportations only began after 1943. Roughly 80% of the Italian Jewish population survived the war. In the post-war period, attempting to curry favor in the international community for humanitarian actions, the Italians felt that they couldn't close the northern borders, as this would appear to be an anti-Jewish policy. Still under the control of the Allied Council, Italian authorities worked in tandem with the British, but frequently turned a blind eye to Jewish infiltrees, making Italy a preferred destination for those seeking to make Aliyah. For many refugees, the time in the DP camps perhaps felt like a second wilderness experience, stuck yet again on a peninsula between liberation and expectation fulfilled. Like their ancestors before them, they could see the, quote, promised land, but were prevented from reaching it. Life in refugee camps in the 1940s, like today, could be a grueling and dehumanizing experience. Refugees were classified by international authorities based on their location of birth, ethnic or religious group, and the believability of their story. Authorities deemed Libyan Jews, for instance, ineligible for formal refugee status altogether, vastly limiting what the latter could hope for. Yet during this time, European Jewish refugees in Italy were able to create an authorized body of representatives called the Organization of Jewish Refugees in Italy, or ODRI, that could speak to power on their behalf. ODRI gave the refugees a sense of self-determination within the camps by offering them some self-representation with the governing authorities. Recognizing that simply surviving the camps would not bring about the much-needed revival of their people, however, the organizers set out on a path of rehabilitation that largely, and perhaps paradoxically, took the form of cultural rebirth. This cultural renewal, however, was slow in starting, as most DPs still held out hope that they would be leaving quickly. But by around April 1946, all the voluntary agencies had begun cultural programs, quote, in reluctant recognition of the fact that the refugee program, contrary to early hopes, was not to be liquidated in a matter of weeks or even months, and that during the enervating period of waiting, the people should be given the opportunity for education and rehabilitation. This enervating period of waiting would soon be filled with the attempts at rebirth started by both refugees and the external agencies there to assist them. They deeply believed in the importance of cultural rebirth within the space of the DP camps in Italy. As the JDC stated, for instance, that, quote, no other country in Europe affords such opportunities for educational and cultural activities. Jewish culture was the air which we, the refugees, breathed. The Jewish person, even if a refugee needed a Jewish school, a Jewish newspaper, a Jewish literary or cultural organization. These words of Eliezer Yerushalmi, first director of the cultural department of ODRI, explained that culture was a necessary part of rebirth. The cultural department of ODRI was responsible for both reviving and creating Jewish culture in the camps. Yet part of their job was to figure out what exactly this culture looked like within the very temporary space of their new but not yet quite home. This culture was in many ways a hodgepodge of distinct cultural trends. It brought into conversation elements of a common Jewish past in Eastern and Central Europe with their present life in Italy and their hopes of a future in Israel. Events from art shows to theater productions, to writing contests, to film screenings, and especially soccer matches, explored what it meant to be a Jewish refugee in Italy. Some of these were distinctly focused on reviving a cultural past left behind or taken away in Europe. Purim plays, for example, reconnected the DPs with their traditions from on old, as costumes and sets were modeled after those found in early 20th century shtetl. Other activities were explicitly future-oriented. Lecture series brought in sponsored speakers from Palestine to excite and prepare their audiences for the joys and trials awaiting them in their new homes. The goal of these activities was to create life through a cultural renewal that was by refugees for refugees. Newspapers quickly became a focal point for the cultural department as they allowed for the easy transmission of information within the camp system in Italy and also across the broader Jewish world. Wall newspapers, like this one held by the YIVO archives, were frequently hung in camps, and all the residents there were encouraged to submit drawings and other writings about camp life. The Center for Jewish History actually just published a wonderful blog post about these wallpapers if you're interested. But by August 1945, ODRI had created their own newspaper called Baderek, which meant on the way. Baderek was distributed freely in the camps and the Haktarot, and it was printed in Rome. At its peak in 1946, it was 6 pages, printed 3 times a week in Yiddish. Although refugees could write into this paper, primarily it was refugee leaders who wrote these columns, and it appears that no female refugees wrote any of the articles. The paper does seem to have been fairly widely read, as reports from the cultural department show that there were never enough copies in the reading room to accommodate all who wanted to read it. So it is difficult to ascertain the efficacy of cultural activities on abstract concepts like raising the spirits of DPs, because we lack quantifiable, measurable standards against which to judge them. But looking at the comments by refugees and aid workers, however, they offer us one window through which we can make some determinations. First, refugee leaders felt that their programming worked. ODRI leader Leo Bernstein, for instance, remarked that the general moral state of the refugees, regardless of their grave political state, shows to be incredible progress. Especially favorable influence on the public life exerts the artistic works. And he attributed this progress to an increase in jobs, new trade schools, and a new cultural life. Aid worker reports also confirm that, quote, when compared to the cost of other phases of our program, the money spent for educational and recreational purposes is the most productive of morale-building values and the most appreciated. The investment in culture produced results. When camps in southern Italy were closing and DPs were being transferred, there was a sudden recognition of how this temporary space had become home-like. As one report showed, quote, it was during this period that people realized how attached they had become to their homes. Even though these are only small rooms, the thought of moving once more was not a pleasant one. However, one could only live in this space of liminality for so long, regardless of how much it began to feel like home. Waiting took its toll on the refugees. Some participated in hunger strikes, like those in the port town of La Spezia, to protest the British blockade to Palestine. Galvanized by their desire to make Palestine their new home, this group of refugees found a way to make this fight public and internationally important. The idea of young people who had until only recently been long denied food by Hitler's regime, now willingly giving up their easy access to food, shocked communities around the world. Ultimately, the fast worked, and its success would inspire many other similar fasts throughout the rest of the tenure of the DP camps in Italy. Jewish refugees were able to call attention to their plight within a broader Jewish community, garnering both international and domestic support for their demands to be able to create their own future on pain of death if necessary. Others grew tired of waiting to emigrate to Palestine and tired of camp life. In its 1945 survey of DP camps, the Audrey report showed that only 2% of DPs wanted to emigrate somewhere other than Palestine. As the years wore on, however, more individuals began to look to emigrate to other countries for a variety of reasons. Some were in that initial group of DPs who wanted to emigrate elsewhere from the beginning. Some found family or other job purposes elsewhere. For some, like Jack W., Palestine was no longer a viable option because the thought of continued communal life was just too difficult. He said, I had no trouble learning to speak Hebrew in the camps. Otherwise, I didn't fit in too well. I felt like a fish out of water in midst of all these strangers. I had no one to talk to and no time to myself. We got up at 6 in the morning and kept going from one communal activity to another until it was time to go back to bed. Everything was done in a group. You couldn't wipe your behind without a discussion and a vote. What type of toilet paper should I use? How many sheets? I just couldn't get used to communal living. He migrated to Canada soon after this. Ultimately, these cases show us that refugee rehabilitation, that is the remaking of the whole person, to give them a purpose beyond simply survival, was the primary goal of DPs and aid workers alike in the post-war world, even if they didn't always agree on how to do it or what it looked like. Rehabilitation looked different, however, for the Libyan Jewish refugees in Italian DP camps. Nearly 30,000 Jewish Libyans left Libya between 1948 and 1951. A minority of these, estimated at between 3,000 and 5,000 individuals, traveled to Italy from Libya, seeking asylum and passage onto Israel. The first pogrom in Tripoli in late 1945 claimed the lives of 130 Libyan Jews. But the assurances of the British military government in control of Libya at the time, and as well as the arrests of some of the instigators, convinced many Libyan Jews to remain in the country. After a second anti-Jewish riot occurred in summer of 1948, however, the majority of Libyan Jews determined to leave Libya. The British, however, refused to issue exit permits. One survivor of the 1945 pogrom described her clandestine journey to Italy, which started when her brothers paid some Libyan Arabs 30,000 lira each to smuggle them safely to the port and then on to Italy. When they arrived in the port town, viewing the boat offshore, she recalled, "I don't know how to swim, but I said I will swim. I went and I went and I went, as if God was holding my hand, to the sea until I reached the ship. We suffered in the ship. The water was coming from here and from there. We were dying. We arrived at this village. We were hungry. We did not have food. Someone had bread and he shared it. Some got some, others did not. Okay, good. Now what do? We went out and started shouting, help, help, help. Where is the help? Fearing for their safety, Libyan Jewish parents brought their children or even sent them alone to Italy in the hopes that they might be looked upon with compassion and helped on their way to Israel. The attitudes of many aid organizations toward the North African DPs were strikingly different, however, from their attitudes toward the Jewish displaced persons from Europe. The International Refugee Organization, or the IRO, officially labeled European Jews as refugees and DPs, thus making them eligible for asylum benefits. North African Jews, in contrast, were nearly all denied refugee status. Like European Jews, these North African adults and children were uncertain as to how long they would be staying in Italy. But unlike European Jews, they had no stable position in the refugee camps. And this lack of stability meant that Libyan refugees and aid workers had to work primarily to achieve the physical trappings of a temporary home, leaving little room to focus on cultural or other rehabilitation. The later months of 1948 and the early months of 1949 show a hodgepodge effort to give care and maintenance at Haksharot spread out through the Rome and Naples regions. However, they still struggled to create the kind of temporary home space that many of the European Jewish DPs had been able to create. Here, the case of the camp in Salerno is instructive about why this may have been. We see two primary issues: the timing of their arrival and a cultural divide between the refugees and the aid workers within the camp. So in late January 1949, as the numbers of Libyan refugees arriving continued to grow, the IRO created a center for unaccompanied children and youth in Salerno, a town just outside of Naples. The JDC and the Youth Aliyah then faced the enormous task of attempting to provide care and maintenance for recuperating individuals without much help from the IRO. Many of the reports from Salerno come from an aid worker named Eva Frankel. Initially, her assessment of the camp provided a promising picture. Quote, "It is far from being perfect, and very many odds and ends need to be seen to. Our main headache is food, as well as there are rather cold nights at present. Otherwise, I cannot stress how wonderful the children are, and it is a great pleasure to work for them." The cold nights could be attributed to the combination of the fact that the camp was only 5 minutes from the sea, and the lodging in the camp consisted of tin Nissen huts, which you can see in the picture on the right. Unfortunately, these odds and ends would largely be left unseen to for the duration of the camp life, as reports of lacking materials continued to pour in. With the majority of Jewish DPs having left the country by mid-1949, it seems that the Libyans were too late to receive the benefits of cultural rehabilitation. Aid worker Frankel argued, quote, that only love and understanding, as well as organized activities, would achieve in no time a happy and disciplined camp. It seems, however, that these well-organized activities were not as stable in Salerno as they had been in camps for European Jews. A pour-in play was performed, and an educational outing to nearby Pompeii was undertaken, which, quote, was most appreciated and liked. But unfortunately, any further excursions have to be stopped, as no transport is available for such purposes. On account of the scarcity of the transport, a musical and dramatical evening had to be canceled. Continued requests for recreational equipment went unheeded by organizations attempting to wrap up their refugee work in Italy. Perhaps the greater issue within the camp, however, was the lack of cultural knowledge about the Jewish experience in North Africa on the part of the British, American, and Israeli aid workers. Separated by culture and language, the children and aid workers often misunderstood each other. "In all my life and experiences in camps," wrote an exasperated aid worker, Frankel, "I have never found any children who are as materialistic as ours. And maybe this is the reason and problem of our work here." But this perceived attachment to material things might have been better understood as a coping mechanism rather than an innate materialism. Many of these children had lived through 2 pogroms in Libya and had watched most, if not all, of their family's possessions destroyed or taken, and had been shipped off to a foreign country remarkably different from their own. Other reports discuss this cultural divide, with aid workers stating, quote, "The North Africans have their own mode of living, and it was not possible within the short period of time they were in Italy to alter any of their habits." Issues such as bare feet and torn clothing were attributed to a lack of supplies available from the warehouse, another timing issue, but also to the belief that it was, quote, "no doubt a habit of the children to go without shoes in North Africa." No space is given in these reports to address why children might be going without shoes in Libya at that time. Given that over 2/3 of the Libyan Jewish population depended entirely on subsidies from international Jewish communities, this was likely a habit that they had acquired simply because they had no means with which to purchase shoes. And the Libyans themselves recognized this disparity in treatment. When their departure for Israel was canceled several times, their aid worker initially attributed this delay to, quote, "mismanagement and a lack of understanding for the children's plight." But in a follow-up letter, she hypothesized further. Not only were the children disappointed, but they had a strong feeling about why they were being left out again. She wrote, "You will never be able to understand how the children feel here and how upset they are that there will be no Aliyah on Thursday. They are all crying and shouting and have great mistrust of all of us. The answer is that they are not leaving because they are not Europeans." And this does, at least in part, seem to correspond to the thinking of the IRO at the time. The IRO wrote that, quote, "It is most improbable that the framers of the Constitution envisaged the organization taking part in refugee problems other than those concerning Europeans. Nor has there been any serious governmental suggestion that the organization should assist non-European refugees." The children's distrust stemmed from broken promises and poor physical rehabilitation. Several youth wrote to the agency in charge of their resettlement, the Youth Aliyah, decrying their sense of being ignored. "I have waited a long time for you, and since you have not shown up, I have spoken to Ms. Frankel and she advised me to write you this note." They felt forgotten, their letters show. Quote, "Since my departure from Tripoli 8 months ago, I have not received any news about my family's papers. Please, please take an interest in my case, not the least because my journey has been like a madman." When their letters to the Youth Aliyah failed to produce better conditions in the camp, and when they continued to be denied departure to Israel, several Libyan youth ran away from the home. Travel manifests attached to a 1951 report from the IRO to the International Tracing Service indicate that nearly all, if not all, of the Libyan children did eventually make it to Israel. Their time in Italy, however, did not offer them the same kind of rehabilitation that had been achieved by many European Jewish DPs. The camps must be turned into kibbutzim, which have given the refugee the illusion, even if temporary, of home and a normal life. A camp with all of its accomplishments remains a camp and has become the modern spark of terror in the heart and the mind of the refugee. The refugee must not lose his faith in the hope of a new life. With a few changes, these words of Leo Bernstein, General Secretary of ODRI and a refugee himself, spoken in 1947, could have been spoken today. We're living in a world where the UN Refugee Agency reports that 70.8 million people are forcibly displaced as refugees, asylum seekers, or stateless persons. And Italy continues to play host to nearly 300,000 of them. Are these migrants finding a home in Italian refugee camps like many of their Jewish post-war predecessors? For some, it seems the answer is yes. Many young people have established relationships with the citizens in Castelnuovo, says a worker for Castelnuovo di Porto Asylum Seeker Center. These young refugees volunteered and played with local sports teams. But the camp, which had been there for over 10 years, has recently been closed, transferring the over 500 refugees living there to other parts of Italy. It is this lack of certainty that defines the modern refugee moment in Italy. Asylum centers are constantly opening and closing, often without any warning, and laws are frequently being rewritten, such that one's legal presence in the country might change from one day to the next. Many, although not all, Jewish refugees in the 1940s held the reasonable expectation that they would soon be moving on to a more permanent home, albeit not as quickly as they would like, which undeniably caused hardship and problems. This assurance, however, allowed many to start remaking the camp into temporary homes. recreating culture and families and places they were in with an eye to the future. For many current refugees, even the promise of a permanent home appears unfulfillable. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Danielle. Before I read the questions, I would like to inform us that with us tonight is actually a person who was born at one of the camps that you were talking about, Christine Evans. Her parents were Peretz and Stella Schechtman. She was born in September 1946 and came to Sydney in 1948. I have the text that by Mike Evans, her son, who says, my father remembered the few years in Italy as some of the happiest of his life. So I just would like to say that we are very honored that we have people with us who are protagonists of your research. These are not the only ones, though, because the first question that we have is a question by Goldie Gordon. Having been born in the DP camp in Trani, which is near Bari in the boot of the Aegean Sea in November 1948, I wonder why this was not shown on the map. My parents arrived there in 1945 and stayed until February 1950 when they emigrated to the US. Danielle?
Yes, Trani and its nearby partner Camp Bari are both very, very important DP camps. I probably should have said, well, this map went up. The map is incomplete. It does not list all of the DP camps, and it definitely does not list any of the Haksharot or these training centers. A current map does not exist of the 35 DP camps and 97 Haksharot. So that is something that we need to work on.
That's a wonderful news, actually, because that's a project for Little Digital Humanities.
Yes, that would be amazing.
Put this together to know. And again, thank you to all who are with us, who have any connections to any of the DP camps. It really feels very special to have you among our attendees. The next question, how can I find out the camp where my parents were in? Samuel and Esther Edelman married in the Jewish synagogue in Torino, boarded the ship Morde Haketo on May 13, 1947, caught by the British and sent to Cyprus.
Yes. I would suggest the first place to look would be the International Tracing Service archives. They've recently been renamed the Bad Arolsen archives. You can now start the search online, but they have much more in-depth help if you write to them directly. So this is a service that collected all of the documentation from UNRWA, from that initial organization, and from the IRO. And then they took all these documents, including a lot of people's identification documents, which would give you information about where your parents were, if these documents still exist for them. These documents were taken to Germany, and they're now being digitized. So you can feel free to write to me directly or look up the International Tracing Service archive online.
The next question. I know Danielle does some advocacy with refugees now, and I was wondering if she would be willing to talk about the parallels between the experiences of Jewish refugees in the 40s and refugees today. The issue of differential access to resources and legal status seemed really poignant to me, having worked in Jordan with Yemeni, Somali, and Sudanese.
Yes, excellent question. I think that's something that a lot of scholars of refugee work are trying to kind of point these connections, this long history of refugee camps, both in Italy and outside of that. I think some of the most important things that I have gathered from my research is how crucial these aid worker organizations are and were in helping people get access to goods and to services and to identity documents that would help them begin to travel onto their new life from their originating country and to really make their way in wherever their new home country is now.
Why were the Libyan children separated from the parents? Sorry if I missed that point.
No, that's an excellent question. So some of the Libyan children were sent by their parents alone, or often in groups, so not one person by themselves. But you would have a group of, say, 50 children who were sent, in part because some parents could not pay for the entire family to be smuggled into Italy. And the thought was, if you send a child and then they're able to get onto Israel, the parents then would have a tie in Israel to reconnect them with. Once they got to Italy, the children were separated into children's centers. This actually became a problem. It was one of the other problems of Salerno, is that for those who did have family in Italy, so if they came over as a family and then were separated once they got there, they often weren't allowed to see their family because of a lack of transit and because of a lack of identification documents. So this was a real problem. Aid organizations at the time thought that rehabilitation would happen better for children in a children's center than in kind of a mixed age camp. There were mixed age camps, but a lot of children were pulled out to the center.
Was Italy the only direction that the Libyan Jews would pick, or were there any attempts to also go to Greece?
I have not heard of any attempts to go to Greece, nor have I seen any in my research, but that is an interesting question and something I should look up further. What I have found thus far is they went to Italy, or they would try to get all the way to Israel. Mm-hmm. From Italy, sometimes they were sent to Marseille if they were quite ill, to recuperate before being sent on to Israel.
Wow. Speaking of different directions, right? Could you say more about what seems a kind of surprisingly antipathetic and counterproductive role of the British throughout this process for both European and Ethiopian, I guess that meant Libyan Jews? What kind of role might anti-Semitism have played in those contexts?
It's a good question. So the British here are often kind of the antagonist in the story. They're the ones who are putting up the blockade, that are keeping people in Italy longer than intended or anticipated. And they're also the ones in charge in Libya. For the most part, the French are also in charge in the southern portion, but that's not where the Libyan Jews lived. The British here are trying to play a role of protecting Arab interests in Palestine and Israel, while also, I don't know that the anti-Semitism is overt or maybe intentional, but it's definitely, I think, a factor in what is happening. I think it's more an international question of the opening of Palestine to a two-state solution or one state. And I think that's the bigger issue here with the British.
It sounds like a lot of children in Italy. Were the Jewish refugees in Italy mostly children, and what seems to have led them to a sense that they wanted to go specifically to Palestine?
Right. So initially, so in 45, let's say, the population is older. It's like 20s to 40s is the majority. We see a similar baby boom that happens in German DP camps that Atina Grossman has written about. This also happens in Italy. People are getting married, having children, and so children definitely take up more space in the later years of the DP camp. There also are Zionist youth organizations that bring children or youth, that is persons from roughly ages 8 to 18 or so, to Italy from Eastern Europe. So that's why we see large groups of children coming. So they come in these Zionist organizations. Why did they want to go to Palestine? Was that the question? I'm sorry.
Yes.
The answers vary, as you might imagine. So according to the questionnaire survey that was filled out by almost 10,000 refugees in that first year, the answers kind of vary from I grew up Zionist It's about a quarter of the population said they grew up Zionist, so they had always intended to do this. About another, just under a quarter, say that they want a Jewish home. So they're not specifically Zionist, they did not grow up that way, but they want a Jewish home given the events of the Holocaust. Others say they don't feel safe in Europe. So this is just, it's less of a Jewish home, but more of a, we need a space that's safe. As the years go by, still the majority of people want to go to Palestine, Israel, but the numbers going elsewhere also increase.
What was the percentage what was the breakdown of origin of displaced Jews in Italian displaced persons camps?
Great question. I did have a slide at some point that I cut with that actually information on it, so I'm sad I cut that. But the majority, around 40%, I think, is Polish origin. Everything underneath that is in between like 5 and 10%. So we see Romanian, like Z. Miller. We see some German and Austrian. We see some from Soviet-based areas. We also see some from Yugoslavia. Very few, but some from Greece. Yeah, that's pretty much maybe a sprinkling of others, but the majority would be Polish, and the majority language would be Yiddish.
It's fascinating because at the same time, a lot of Polish non-Jewish citizens end up in Italy. So it looks like these routes were pretty popular, I would say.
Yeah, Italy is a place of, it's a landing spot to go elsewhere. Mm-hmm. For many.
How did the local Italians at the time view the camps and their inhabitants?
The answer to this question varies kind of by region. So reports from the south, kind of in the heel of the boot, where there were several camps. These camps actually were started in 1943, so before the end of the war even. There we see reports that Italians are very happy with the camps. The camps bring in additional revenue, they bring in additional material goods that then are given or bartered with the local Italian population, so it's a boost to their economy. Elsewhere, we see, particularly in protests against the British, we see Italian support for the Jewish DPs. So whether they're supporting them because they're Jewish DPs or because they're anti-British, that's perhaps a question, but they're certainly supportive of these protests in particular. There are some reports of there are some arrests by Italian officers for black marketing and for illegal activities like this. They're less frequent. So overall, the kind of feeling of the Italians was often quite good. These refugees weren't taking their jobs. For the most part, it was fine. As the years wore on, it gets a little bit less congenial, but still overall fairly pleasant.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask my question. Little privilege of a host. How would you balance or assess to what extent this cultural attempts of having such a strong Jewish cultural programming or cultural almost formation, if you will, to what extent the refugees were just receptive and passively taking it, and to what extent this was also out of their own initiative? What was the role of institutions, and what was the role of refugees in that process? Because it really is, especially compared to German DP camps, it is really very unique for that time.
Yeah, so more activities are started by the organizations because they're the ones with the funds and with the personnel who can institute these kinds of activities. The DPs, however, you often see reports of like self-put on production, so theater or like music. They also are able to create this organization of Jewish refugees that kind of plays this middleman role, this middle person role, that they are refugees themselves, but they have a level of authority. So they're kind of in the middle of that like top-down, bottom-up approach. So most activities are started by the top down. We see smaller things. So like some of these wall newspapers, for instance, would be a lot of kind of your everyday average refugee is writing in. Something like Byway, or they also have a literary magazine called Inhabitants. These would be contributed to largely by leadership roles who were refugees themselves, but had a role of more authority.
Mm-hmm. The photographs and descriptions look and sound so much like my parents' and brothers' experiences in DP camps run by the USA in Germany. Why would the experiences be almost identical?
Yeah, so I mean, they're having similar experiences. The same types of people and even the same organizations are in charge. So UNRWA and the IRO are running camps in both of these places, in the US zone and in Italy. The voluntary aid organizations are run by the same people. So a lot of the activities are going to look very similar. The camp spaces are going to look very similar. One of the differences in Italy is that the UNRWA caseload or the IRO caseload was 80% Jewish, whereas in Germany it's much smaller. So Jewish DPs make up a smaller portion of the DP population in Germany than they do in Italy, even though there are quite a few non-Jewish DPs also in Italy.
What was the reception of local Italians? You have answered that. Was one place more friendly than others? Were Jews allowed to open their own businesses outside of DP camps to make some money of their own?
Some did, not a large number, in part because that required like language resources that some wouldn't have had. It also required connections that many didn't have. So if you were able to make those connections or had them before the war, let's say, some people were able to leave the camps to start up their own businesses. These people often then left for Australia or the US rather than Israel. People who were focused on getting to Israel often stayed within the centers to take on the certificate courses that were put out by ORT. To kind of gain new skills that they would then take with them. So that would be the more common experience. But a handful of refugees were able to kind of create their own spaces, workspaces.
Was there a big circulation among DP camp refugees? So in other words, were they traveling among the camps?
Yes, so in some cases, they would travel frequently. So you can actually follow this. This is what the International Tracing Service Archives is also useful for, kind of in tracking where DPs went and how frequently, because every time they moved to a different camp, it would be listed. Some seem to have traveled more frequently than others, perhaps leaving without permission from one camp to another in hopes of leaving the country altogether. Some were moved, some would stay in a camp for 2 years and then the camp would close. So the camps in the south were closed and DPs were moved kind of up to a more central port city. So some were highly mobile, but almost all of them spent time in more than one camp.
Were the DP, especially the ones for children, but in general, were the refugee camps exclusively Jewish, and were they kept exclusively Jewish, or were they mixed? Because, for example, in Tehran, there were some camps that were mixed with Jews and non-Jews in them.
So this was a huge issue, particularly in Germany and Austria. This question of mixed camps or segregated camps. It's kind of is instituted in part by the Harrison Report that comes out from the US investigation of these camps. In Italy, the camps are not officially segregated. That's not the policy of the IRO. So the policy is not to segregate, but the operating procedure was often separate camps. So you did have camps. So in the southern region, you would often have camps of Jews and, in particular, Yugoslavian non-Jewish refugees would live in the same camp area. The Haksharot were almost always Jewish exclusively. Can't think of any that weren't. But the camps were sometimes segregated, but again, the Jews made up a large percentage of the DP population.
Mm-hmm. I was surprised to see the sports t-shirts specifically with Jewish stars in the upper left corner. It seems like it would have created very bad associations for many of the residents of these camps.
Yes, so this is something that surprised me as well. But not every sports team had it, but it's a fairly common feature. My supposition is that they're turning the symbol into something positive. They're reclaiming the symbol. You hear a lot of testimonies of people, of survivors who come out and see Palestinian brigade soldiers, for instance, who have the Star of David on their uniform and saying that was the moment that they knew that this was going to be okay. This was another symbol of rebirth. And so I think that's actually really important. So thanks for noticing that.
If I may add something, this was also very often the case in the 30s when Jews were gradually forbidden from, especially young kids, forbidden from activities of others. All the Jewish sports teams would actually have the Star of Davids on their t-shirts. So I think we tend, this is actually us interpreting history much more than what was the case, because like for us, the star worn at piece of clothing at the outfit means brings us only to war and to the ghettos. Whereas for a long time, this was a symbol of pride of those who were rejected from the regular lives. So I think that here this would be somewhere in between, that this was sort of not just reclaiming, but actually coming back to how.
Yeah, absolutely. A previously common practice. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. Have you found competition between different Zionist organizations in the Italian DP camps? Do you have a sense of the political and social trajectory of these migrants once they made it to Palestine?
Yes, the short answer to that is yes. So there was infighting. This was often solved by creating new Haksharot, which is why you had so many, in part. So different Zionist organizations would run their own. They would then compete for aid from the JDC or from the World Jewish Congress. The people in the camps, it's not always clear that whether they were aligned with these Zionist organizations pre-wartime experiences, or if they came aligned after. It's a bit of a mix. So there's a lot of reports of kind of this infighting, and who gets to make Aliyah first is a constant problem until 48.
Mm-hmm. What about original Italian Jews? I know many of them survived. Did they tend to return to Italy and even to any of these camps?
That's an interesting question. So around 80% of the Italian Jewish population survives the war. So a small number of those who were deported survive the camps and return. They do return. I don't have any percentages on that, I'm sorry. But in large part, they do return, and they do try to go home. Their experience with the DP camps would only be if they were brought back from say a concentration camp with an organization. They may spend a small period of time in the camps, and then they would be helped by the Italian Jewish community in Italy, who was also relying on the JDC and the World Jewish Congress for aid and assistance. So they would not have spent very much time, if any, in the camps.
Did the Jewish DP communities exist in Italy in addition to the DP camps, as some did in post-war Germany?
Did Jewish
DP communities exist in Italy in addition to the DP camps, as some did in post-war Germany?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The distinction between a community and a camp, is that maybe they're thinking of like centers, like outside of the camp structure. Some Jewish DPs did live outside of camp. They were able to live outside of camp with a smaller subsidy in one of the surrounding towns. So some lived in Rome or Milan, for instance. They were still connected to the Jewish DP community, in part because they had to get their papers re-upped and to get their aid from. But I'm not sure if that's answering the question, so feel free to.
In case it isn't, we ask for a follow-up. Why did you choose Italian DP camps versus German?
I started actually working on Italian anti-Semitism. So my first master's was on the question of Italian anti-Semitism pre and post-war. And then I grew interested in kind of this post-war moment in Italy, in part because I was interested in the number of people that were pouring in and trying to get out of being stuck.
Mm-hmm. Did you come across any information about Aharon Appelfeld?
I have not looked specifically for information about him, but I know he spent some time in the DP camps.
Mm-hmm. And that was the last question. So unless someone is busy typing their quick question right now, it looks like we don't have any more questions left, which is still quite an impressive amount. Oh, someone, last one. How did you come to realize the parallel between Jewish and other refugees in Italy?
How did I come to realize the parallel, like in numbers or just experience? Maybe they mean in the present day, kind of those parallels?
I think so, yeah.
Yes, so if we're thinking present day, I do volunteer with an aid organization that resettles refugees here in my hometown in New Jersey. And that organization sent me to Italy for a week and a half to kind of get experience with the current refugee crisis in Italy, in part because that's where we had a partner organization, and in part because I had some experience thinking about Italian DP camps. And so that trip kind of started some of the thinking about how these two distinct groups, what kind of parallels and discontinuities we can see between them.
Mm-hmm. So we have a confirmation that it was indeed about DPs living outside of the camp structure. Thank you for the answer. The last question is, are any camps still open?
Yes. I mean, not for Jewish refugees,
mm-hmm.
But there are many camps still open in Italy. A large number of them are in Sicily. They're outside of Rome. They're scattered throughout. It's interestingly similar to the DP moment in the post-war, that camps are scattered throughout Italy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It doesn't look like it ends. What was Primo Levi's role?
So he was an Italian survivor. He survived and made it back to Italy. He's one who, at least in a small way, experienced a part of the DP camp. He went through a processing center in Milan. He has some very interesting comments about that processing center, that it was full of people. Mm-hmm. Do we have maybe a last question? Would that be go about?
I think the time has come. Some factions of Catholic Church in Italy were involved in rescuing Jews. Were they involved in supporting DP camps in Italy after the war?
They definitely were involved in rescue and in many facets. I have not come across them as much in the DP moment. They are in part working with DPs from other religions, so non-Jewish DPs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you very much for your patience with answering all of our questions.
Thank you. They're wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the attendees, especially if I may honor again those who have anything to do and anything biographically connected to the DP camps. It was really a great honor to have you with us tonight. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
This program, as all our programs in the times of pandemic, is of course free, but if you would like to donate and support the center so that we are able to have even more programs like that and perhaps be able to invite Danielle again and people like her, please donate if you wish. You can go to our website and do that. Also, we will be sending you an information once the video is available on our YouTube channel. And please make sure to sign up to our newsletter so that you can know and be up to date with all of our other programs. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Danielle. I understand that you're defending soon, right?
I am defending soon.
So on behalf of all our attendees tonight and on behalf of the center, of course, we'll be keeping our fingers crossed, and we will be very happy to be the first ones to congratulate you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Good night.